Most of us knew Jim Snow as the Honorable James Snow, the longtime Minister of Transportation in the government of Bill Davis, one of the most respected premiers in the history of our province. In his 1990 autobiography, Mr. Jim, Jim described himself as a farmer, contractor, businessman, aviator, and politician. Jim certainly was all of those things, but from a purely human context, Jim was above all else a fearless learner with a relentless energy, determination, and industry. Case in point, but a little background first. I knew Jim through my parents and his son James, and I had interviewed him at Queen's Park many times when he was Minister of Transportation and I was a television reporter. But we did not become good friends until he sat down to write his autobiography in 1989. We really didn't know one another tremendously well when he called me out of the blue one day to drop by the barn at Pineland Farm. He had something he wanted to show me. When I entered his office, through the haze of pipe smoke, Jim was scrolling through the first draft of his book from a very large, for the time, 21-inch computer screen attached to a computer server, both state-of-the-art technologies. To put this in perspective, Jim was 60 years old at the time. Personal computers were barely mainstream technologies, and other than Jim Dills, I didn't know anyone from the greatest generation who was using a computer. I was blown away. His computer skills were flawless. He quickly put his manuscript on a disk, handed it to me, and told me to go away and read it. 5 years earlier, I had been hired by IBM to introduce the IBM PC and would go on to have a great 25-year career in the North American information technology industry. Technology, the Tories, and local history helped forge a friendship with Jim Snow. We spent most of the next hour talking about technology and, of course, politics and current events. As the founder of the Town of Milton Walk of Fame, I'm often asked how a community the size of Milton develops so many world-class athletes, artists, business leaders, humanitarians, philanthropists, and scientists. Whenever I answer the question, I think of Jim. Milton's agricultural-based economy created a strong foundation for healthy food production and consumption, good-paying jobs and wealth creation, and an effective education system. Jim was a product of that strong foundation. And it all started here, in this very house, on this very farm, almost 90 years ago, on Orangeman's Day, July 12th. Named for his maternal grandfather and former Canadian Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier, James Wilfrid Snow had a normal childhood, if normal as living through the Great Depression and World War II. And let me just take a minute and take you through his autobiography where he speaks about that childhood life during the dirty 30s and the Great Depression. Jim writes, "At this time, the Big Depression was in full force. All farm prices were very depressed, and everyone was struggling to make ends meet. Mother and Dad had bought our 200-acre farm in a squeezing township in about 1918, and of course still had a large mortgage on which to make payments. The farm had a large, solid stone house built around 1850 that was considered a good house at that time. My father was a very hard-working and ambitious man and wanted very much to pay all his bills and make a living for his wife and family. In order to increase income, he rented and sharecropped other farms, but with the economy in such a state, the more he grew, the more debts built up. And as the prices were so low, they could not even cover the cost of production. One thing about living on a farm under those circumstances, we had most of our own food, so we never really went hungry. Andy Fleming, one of our neighbors, who had been a butcher, would help us slaughter our own pork and salt it down for the winter meat. In the summer, we, along with our neighbors, formed a beef ring. In this way, one farmer contributed an animal each week, which Jim Wilson slaughtered and distributed the fresh beef to all the ring's members, being careful every member rotated and shared in the good cuts. The Colson's bakery truck delivered bread twice a week, which I remember cost 5 cents a loaf. At this stage, there was no electric power in our area, and of course no refrigeration except for some ice we could cut on the Milton Pond in the winter, haul home with the team and sleigh, and store inside us in an old ice house which was located on the west end of the driving shed. Mother did a great deal of baking and preserving. Each summer and fall, she would put down hundreds of jars of fruit and vegetables for the next winter. Mother would take us kids and go to Darling's bush each summer to pick wild raspberries and black caps that she would use to make jams and jellies. This sure was a hard way to get fruit, fighting off the black flies and mosquitoes as you picked. Mother usually bought the staples, flour, sugar, etc., from Ernie Middleton's store in Milton, as we had something to sell to pay the grocery bill, like all rural farm families. During the Great Depression, we had little money, but always ate well on wholesome but not fancy food. Many farm families were impacted by World War II, and Jim's family was one of them. 2 of the 3 Snow boys went off to war, making it increasingly difficult for Jim's dad to operate the farm. He sold it in 1941. The war would strike the Snow family even harder in 1943. And I'll read again from Jim's book. In July, Brother Bill was reported slightly injured in action, the telegram had said, with abrasions, but soon was back flying on bomber missions over Germany. We found out later that he had bailed out of the Wellington bomber so low that his parachute only partially opened, but he came down in an apple tree which cushioned the landing. In August, his Wellington bomber had a crash landing in England returning from a mission. He was only slightly injured again and was soon back in service. Soon after this, his squadron was equipped with the new Lancaster bombers, perhaps some of the ones he helped to build at A.V. Rowe a few years earlier, which he said were much faster and safer. On September the 16th, Bill was reported missing in action over Germany on his first bombing mission with the new Lancaster. Neither he nor any of his crew members on the Lancaster have ever been heard from since. The station agent from the CNR in Milton came up to the manse one afternoon, but his dad was not home yet. He said he would come back later. He returned about 7 o'clock that evening with the telegram telling us that Bill was missing in action. 36 Lancasters were lost on this one bombing mission over the city of Essen, Germany. Not satisfied with working for others, Jim's dad bought another farm near War's End in 1944. And while Jim was an excellent student, typically scoring in the high 90s in high school math, he quit school to farm with his dad. He was active in 4-H and the Halton Junior Farmers and received farm-related education through those organizations, as well as through the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture office and the Ontario Agricultural School in Guelph. Like many farmers, Jim had 2 jobs, farming and construction. His exposure to home building in the late 1940s led to the establishment of Snow Construction. Jim began building homes in Oakville, which led to the construction of many significant commercial and institutional buildings in southern Ontario over the next 25 years. In the early 1950s, Jim made 2 key decisions that would redefine him as being more than the successful entrepreneur he had become. In 1950, he joined the Lions Club of Oakville. In 1952, he married Barbara Hughes. Over his almost 60-year association with the Lions Club, he consistently demonstrated leadership, vision, and extraordinary philanthropy. Oakville specifically, and the Lions organization generally, greatly benefited from Jim's organizational and financial leadership over the years. During his 56-year marriage to Barb, they raised 4 great children, James, Jeffrey, Julie, and Jennifer. And Jim refers to this in his book. Since the fall of 1951, Barbara has been my constant companion, partner, and advisor in all my business and political endeavors. Our family of 2 sons, James Douglas and Jeffrey Owen, and 2 daughters, Julie Barbara and Jennifer Nancy, who have been so much of a part of our lives and our plans over the years, are our proudest accomplishment. They have now provided us with a new generation of 6 wonderful grandchildren to grow up and take their place in this bountiful country of ours. While business, philanthropy, and Barb were the biggest influences in Jim's life, it was politics that would come to define him in the minds of most Halton residents. And I'm going to refer to Jim's book, where he talks about the beginning of his political career. And he talks about a former MPP, Stan Hall, as he starts the conversation about his political aspirations. And Stan, Jim writes, always impressed me with his sincerity and availability. Many times earlier, I had the notion that I would like to succeed Stan when he retired, but never gave it much serious thought. When Stan died and the riding was open in 1963, I was so busy farming I took no interest in the nomination. After reading the local press that January Sunday morning, I went to bed and fell asleep pondering whether this was my opportunity if I ever wanted to try my hand at politics again. I awoke early in the morning, all in a sweat, after dreaming of life as a provincial politician. I always had a great respect and admiration for Premier John Robarts, which encouraged me to be on his team. I went to Milton to see my old friend Carl Martin on the Monday morning about 7 o'clock and asked him what he thought about the upcoming Conservative nomination. Carl, a lifelong Conservative worker and supporter, said, "I'm not impressed. Are you interested in running?" I told him I was thinking about it, but had not decided, as I knew very little about politics. Carl advised me that if I was interested, I should get going and go after the nomination and not sit back waiting for the party organization to approach me. I went to see John Depew, the lawyer from Oakville and secretary of the Riding Association, who advised that there was an executive meeting the next Saturday and that he would put my name before the group and get a response. I told him I would contact him on the Monday morning. I went back to see him. The party indicated to him that it would be pleased to see me run if I wished, but the executive were not going to support any particular candidate. I decided to seek the nomination and walked across the street from John's office to the Oakville Journal office and told the editor, and a fellow Lion, by the way, of my intentions. The next day, I was on the front page of the Journal and I was in the race for the nomination. For the next couple of months, I spent every spare minute meeting party members, campaigning for the nomination. I didn't have too much time because I had a lot of construction work to look after, the farm to oversee, and my Lions work as well. The nominated convention was held in the auditorium of Milton High School on March 17th. There was a heavy snowstorm that night, but we still had 300 members come out to vote. I made what I am sure was a terrible speech, but for some reason or another I was able to muster enough votes to win over the other two candidates on the first ballot. Barb and Jamie, who is now 10 years old, were of course in attendance, and I am sure more nervous that evening than I was, probably because I was numb. And then, of course, the general election followed on October 17th, 1967, and Jim talks about that evening. Finally, the polls closed. I went out to the local Hornby poll to act as my own scrutineer, mainly to put in the time. By the time results were coming in, I was leading by 100 votes. But after visiting the Georgetown workers, we headed to Milton to see how we were doing. When we arrived there, the gloom had set in, as I was now trailing by close to 100 votes. Heading then to Oakville, we heard on the radio that I was ahead again, only to get to headquarters and find out I'd dropped behind again. This is the way it went for the rest of the night. We anxiously awaited every poll for the result. Finally, our results at headquarters were in, and we had a 140 vote majority. Unfortunately, the official returning officer's final result only gave me about a 60 vote majority. Everybody else had left for Pineland to go to the party, but I wasn't satisfied. I went to the returning officer's headquarters to try to reconcile the difference between our count and his. No such luck. We still had a difference. Reluctantly, I finally left to go home to the party, but I didn't really feel like celebrating with such a shaky win. The next day, the final tabulation was released, giving me a great majority of 164 votes, with the Liberal opponent calling for a recount. I was concerned about a recount and went to Toronto to see Hugh Latimer at party headquarters. Hugh told me that he'd been involved in elections for 50 years and that I was safe as a church mouse. He said he had never seen an election changed by a recount yet where the difference was more than 25 votes. I went home feeling a little better. The recount never took place, and my election was confirmed, shaky as it was. In 1971, Jim was named Minister without Portfolio when Premier Bill Davis replaced Premier John Robarts as Premier. He was promoted to Minister of Public Works and Minister of Government Services in 1972. Of note during Jim's time as Minister of Government Services was his oversight of the construction of numerous government buildings across the province, most notably Maplehurst Correctional Center in Milton and the Ontario Agricultural Museum. However, it was Jim's promotion to Minister of Transportation and Communications in 1975 that allowed him to make his greatest contributions to public life, not only in Ontario, but across the country and, frankly, internationally as well. During his time as minister, he introduced mandatory seatbelt legislation for adults, child restraint seats for children, and the safety features you see on all school buses today. Jim oversaw the greatest expansion of provincial infrastructure in the province's 152-year history, ushering in numerous major highways across Ontario, including Highways 402, 403, 410, 417, the 404 extension, and the land purchase for Highway 407 and the Pearson line between downtown Toronto and Pearson International Airport. There was also the construction of numerous municipal airports across Ontario and public transit development outside Toronto. There was also some controversy. When the extension of Highway 404 began before the completion of an environmental assessment, even though Jim's deputy minister claimed responsibility, Jim personally paid the $3,500 fine. Talk about personal integrity. But that was a minor incident compared to his exchange with Queen Elizabeth. And I'll go back to Jim's book to share with you that matter. As part of Ontario's bicentennial celebrations, Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip visited Canada. This involved the planning of the many official events which the Queen and Prince Philip would attend. The one I was involved with was the official opening of the Loyalist Gates and Parkway at Amherst View. In addition to opening the Parkway, she visited the refurbished historic pioneer home at Amherst View, and met with a couple of native Indians from the reserve close by. Saturday the 25th was the main bicentennial celebrations with Queen Elizabeth and the Prince at Queen's Park. This was attended by thousands, with University Avenue all decorated with bicentennial banners hanging from every lamppost. In the evening was the Royal Salute tattoo. On Sunday morning, all hell broke loose, and I received more publicity in one day than I received in the rest of my 18 years in public life. Barb and I awakened to hear on the 6 o'clock news that I had touched the Queen's elbow, or back, as I was escorting her across the road at Amherst View on Thursday. This was a big item on the news. They were quoting headlines from the British Sunday tabloids. On the 7 o'clock news was a repeat of all this good stuff. Just before 8 o'clock, I had a call from Bill Walker of CFRB, who happened to be a resident of Oakville, wanting to know what this was all about. I told Bill I didn't know anything about it, and I explained the ceremony that they were talking about. Bill set the record a little straight in his 8 o'clock broadcast. We then had a call to say the Toronto Sunday Sun had a 4-inch headline and front page story about this event. Barb was very upset about all of this. Very upset. We went to lunch with a number of cabinet ministers, and about that time I received a call from a Sir Somebody, the Queen's secretary, wanting to assure us that the Queen knew nothing about this issue and saying all she could remember was how helpful I was in escorting her through the ribbon-cutting process. She did not want us to be concerned and wanted us to come to the dinner on the Britannia that evening, at which time she wished to talk with us. He warned me that Prince Philip might have something to say to me at the dinner. His comment when he was shown the Toronto Sun article was, he should have given her the John Turner pat. So, they get to Britannia. After cocktails in the lounge, we were joined by the royal couple and escorted into a huge stateroom for dinner. The group for dinner must have been about 40 guests. After a very formal dinner with waiters galore and so much silverware you didn't know which ones to use, we went back to the lounge for liqueurs. Everyone was standing around the lounge in a large circle when the Queen and Philip walked across the room to Barb and I to chat. All of a sudden, you could have heard a pin drop. I don't really remember what they said, but it was obvious that she was not at all upset. Jim retired from provincial politics in 1985 to become the founding chairman of the Federal Civil Aviation Tribunal in Ottawa. He left Queen's Park as not only the first cabinet minister from Halton, but the longest-serving minister of transportation in Ontario's history, and indeed in Canada's history. The province of Ontario continues to benefit from a number of decisions Jim made during his 10-year service as minister. While Jim was modest about his considerable personal and political accomplishments, those who knew him well would acknowledge he was not without strong opinions about the world around him, and he was not reluctant to express them publicly when he felt it appropriate to do so. I heard from Jim frequently during my first go-round as a Milton councillor. Over the last 20 years of his life, he became a trusted advisor and mentor to many in Halton's political scene and beyond. He came to be recognized as a sage observer of current events locally, provincially, and nationally. Many of us are fortunate to be a success at just one thing during our lives. Jim was successful in agriculture, in business with Snow Construction and Tube Fab Limited, and of course in public life with the Ministry of Government Services, the Ministry of Transportation, and the Civil Aviation Tribunal. These successes combined to make his retirement after 1990 almost as fulsome as his working life. In the decade following the publication of his autobiography, Jim served as director, treasurer, and eventually president of the Canadian Owners and Pilots Association. In 1999, when he turned 70, he taxied down the runway at Burlington Airpark for the final time, later selling his beloved Cessna 210 and retiring from Copa. He purchased Hornby Towers Golf Club in 2000, renamed it Hornby Glen Golf Course, and made many improvements to the old North Halton course before selling it in 2005. In 2006, Jim and Barb donated Pineland Farm, their family home and property for 44 years, to the Salvation Army. This was groundbreaking in terms of its generosity as well as its impact on the local social scene. Heavily decorated with photographs and other memorabilia associated with the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party and illustrative of Jim's carpentry and woodworking skills, the barn was affectionately known by locals as the Tory Museum. Every federal and provincial Tory leader from the late 1960s onward addressed fundraisers there, including former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and former Ontario Premiers John Robarts, Bill Davis, Frank Miller, Mike Harris, and Ernie Eves. It was also the setting for some of the largest non-political fundraisers ever held in the community, including those in support of Conservation Halton and Milton District Hospital. Following the donation of Pineland Farm and the sale of Hornby Glen Golf Course, Jim and Barb donated $500,000 to Milton District Hospital for a CAT scan and their fundraising campaign to buy that equipment. For their considerable contributions to the community, Jim and Barb received Lifetime Achievement Awards from Milton Chamber of Commerce in 2007. For the national and international prominence Jim brought to Milton, Ontario, and Canada during his tenure in government, he was inducted into the Town of Milton's Walk of Fame in 2007. On Saturday, September 13, 2008, the 56th anniversary of his marriage to Barb, Jim passed away at age 79 of complications from diabetes at Milton District Hospital, surrounded by his family. Former Ontario PC Party leader John Tory and former Oakville Provincial PC Riding Association President Jack Lewis spoke about Jim's life to a packed congregation of mourners at historic St. Paul's United Church in Milton. Now I'll just sort of go back to Jim's book and read to you his thoughts about his life. Over the past few months as I've been putting these pages together, many things have happened in my lifetime that have come to mind. Some of these have been disappointments. Others have been very important achievements, and at least, well, to me. There are things that I regret doing or not doing, and there are things that I am very proud to have accomplished. I am very happy that I had the opportunity to grow up in a rural community at a time when I was able to know from personal experience of the hardships that were suffered by so many during the Great Depression years of the 1930s. To have witnessed the way my parents and our rural farm neighbors worked together, loaned and shared to help and support each other during these times was an education you could never get in school. Having this experience gave me a different philosophical outlook on managing my affairs to that of the following generation. Having the opportunity to attend and receive most of my education in a one-room country school, with only one teacher for 8 grades, is an experience I would not have wanted to miss. Many will disagree and say that the education in the larger central schools was much superior from an educational standpoint, and perhaps they are right. I still believe that the rural learning, with boys and girls of different ages in the same classroom, it added greatly to my understanding of my fellow man in later years. One of my regrets is that I did not continue in high school, at least for another 2 or 3 years. I doubt that my family could ever afford to send me to a university during those times, even if I had completed grade 13. If a broader range of optional subjects had been available at high school, I probably would have stayed in school longer. It was those languages, French and Latin, that turned me away from school. Although I would like to have had a university education, my life has been one great, long learning experience ever since leaving school in grade 10. I have said many times, and will say again, I would not trade my experience and the knowledge that I received working with my father on the farm during my early years for any formal education or degree that I could have obtained. Knowing how to till the soil, grow crops from the small seeds you plant, breed and rear livestock, treat them when they are sick, and butcher them for your meat supply is knowledge that will never leave me. Working with my father all those years, from leaving school until his death in 1959, was a great learning experience. And that, my friends, concludes the life of Jim Snow. Thank you.